Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Exploring A Course in Miracles podcast live recording. I'm Emily Bennington, Executive Director of the Circle of Atonement, and I'm here with Circle founder Robert Perry. And today we are talking about Bill's journal. It should be no surprise that we are referring to Bill Thetford, co-scribe of A Course in Miracles, but what might be a surprise to even longtime course students is that Bill kept a journal from August to September of 1966, which is just under a year after the course began to come through. The journal itself isn't very long, it's only 6 pages, and it's really just Bill's rather short-lived attempt to reflect on things that happened in his day. But what makes Bill's journal so meaningful and so compelling for our purposes is that it's clear how seriously he was taking the practice of the course right from the beginning of the process. And to give you just a bit of a timeline here, the material that became A Course in Miracles was dictated by co-scribe Helen Schucman over a period of 7 years, from 1965 until 1972. Bill's journal, as I mentioned, was written in 1966, again, about a year after the course started to come through. And at the time that Bill was writing his journal, Helen was taking down chapters 11 and 12 of the text. There are 31 chapters in the text, so this wasn't even halfway into the dictation of that volume. And of course, there was no workbook at this point. There was no manual for teachers. There was no clarification of terms and no supplements. So you have to travel back in time a bit and imagine that the course material is completely new and that Helen and Bill are not only grappling with the surprise of receiving it, but also grappling with how to apply it. And this is where Bill's journal becomes really interesting because it offers us a window into his process and his thinking that is extremely valuable. Robert has created a summary of Bill's attempts to live the course that were taken from Bill's journal that we're going to use as a guide for our discussion today. And you can download that summary as well as Bill's journal itself at circleofa.org/Bill. Robert, before we get into the heart of our conversation today, in our last podcast, when we spoke to Bill's dear friend and biographer, Carol Howe, we mentioned that it's important to us here at the Circle to help students know more about Bill's contribution to the course and also just to know more about him as a person. So is there anything that you want to say on that topic before we dive into the journal?
Well, I find this journal of Bill's to be so revealing. It's quite inspiring to really read what he was doing in his attempts to live the course. And I think that we should think back on Bill, as so many people do, as somebody who was really sincere and serious in trying to live and to embody the course. And you see it this is practically right from the beginning, just like 10 months in. And what I find so interesting about this journal is that the perennial question with the Course in Miracles is, how do we live this? And there's so many different ideas about that. There's a very strong current out there that says, well, it's strictly in your mind, and you kind of realize there's nobody out there, and you're only intent on changing your mind. I heard a writer once talk about the miracle as, well, you go out into the world, you see that someone's in need, and then you correct your misperception that they're in need, and you kind of walk on. So Bill's journal, in my mind, it shows how Bill, and you can see that Helen was in the same camp. It shows how Bill and Helen were seeing the living of these teachings. And what Bill's picture of that is so much the picture that we have built up over the years at the Circle. He was essentially just following what Jesus had been telling them to do and trying to put it into action.
Yeah, and that really comes through in ways that we're going to talk about today. Again, what we have done here is pulled out of Bill's journal ways in which he sought to practice the course. We have a list of 11 that we're going to go through very quickly, and then we're going to wrap up with 3 big points at the end. So the first category that we have here is reading the course, and there's not a lot. Bill's journal, as I mentioned, is only 6 pages. There's not a lot here, but there is a reference to reading the course in the journal, and we know from this and from Bill's life in general that he was a very serious student with a real desire to master the material, right?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of references. One is that he would meet every morning to go over the material with Cal Hatcher. And then another one, he says Sunday a.m., got up around 7 and tried to devote attention to notes, meaning the course, until 1 when Helen arrived. Well, that's a 6-hour study period. I mean, that's pretty hefty. It's also clear he quotes the course, he pays attention to its specific words, he wants to master the material. All of that clearly is rooted in a real respect for the reading of the book.
Yeah, and he doesn't put quotation marks around it when he quotes the course. He just references sometimes he doesn't put quotation marks around it, sometimes he does, but he doesn't do that often. And so as a course student, if you're familiar with the material, you can pick up on it as you go through the journal. But as a new student, as somebody who just was receiving this material, the fact that he's quoting it so often in the journal says that he really was reading it and paying attention to it closely.
Oh yeah. I mean, the journal is really it's about his efforts to apply the material, which of course is grounded in reading it.
Right. So speaking of trying to apply the material, our next topic is meditation. This is a topic that doesn't get much airtime in course circles, but it is a practice in the course, and Bill was obviously a fan. So what does he say about meditation in his journal?
Well, first of all, I'll say that meditation was an important part of the early story of the course. Bill had come upon it while they were in those months that preceded the course coming through, when Helen was having various unusual experiences. Her first intervision came during a meditation, and Bill had encouraged her to meditate, encouraged them to meditate together. And then there were a number of references to it in the early chapters of the course. So we know that they were meditating because Jesus refers to it, refers to issues that Helen was having during meditation. But of course, its main presence in the course is in the workbook. It's a major presence in the workbook. It's not called meditation except once in the workbook. That's obviously what it is. You don't have to, have the name to spot what it is. So it's already clearly an important part of the course. And in his journal, Bill mentions meditation a few times. He mentions how he was asking for guidance during meditation once, and he's also trying to help a friend of his in Chicago, who had come close to suicide the previous year, and Helen and Bill had a rather unusual experience that seemed to save him from what was going to be a suicide attempt. So he says about his communication with this same person a year later, I emphasized importance to him of silent meditation, making his mind as blank as possible at the same time every day. He has promised to do this, and we will follow up next week. So, this friend of his, Joe, we don't know his last name, was having a hard time. And that hard time had not ended here. There's a whole story, which we'll get into later, of how Helen and Bill were continuing to try to help him. And this was one of the ways Bill was trying to help him. Basically, he was handing out meditation prescriptions like a doctor, once a day, same time every day, make your mind as blank as possible. We'll follow up next week. It's pretty interesting.
Yeah, it is, especially since the meditation instructions that came through before the course proper were for Bill to help him become a meditator. So he was a relatively new meditator at this point, but he really took to the practice.
He did, yeah. And I think the main instructions around meditation were to help Helen with the fear reaction she was having. There's a couple of instances where Jesus is trying to help her out of that fear.
When did telling Bill to clear his mind and focus on "Here I am, Lord" come through?
Well, that was literally the night before the course itself began to come through.
That's
There
what
was
I
the
was
whole,
referring to.
yeah. Oh, okay, right. Sorry. Yeah. So those were meditation instructions for Bill, like you said. Yeah. And that was part of the very first like flow of guidance that Helen got, and it led right into the beginning of the course.
Yeah. And just as a quick pause here, because we're kind of going through these categories fairly quickly. Jesus gave Helen meditation instructions for Bill that said to begin the practice, clear your mind and focus on the phrase, "Here I am, Lord." And I know many students here at the Circle and elsewhere have found just that simple meditation technique to be very powerful.
Yeah, he said, pulling your mind slowly from everywhere else and center it on these words and don't think of anything else. So you just have your total attention on saying, "Here I am, Lord," which when you do it, it feels like you are, standing before God.
Right. And so if you're a new student who's trying to get into the practice of meditation, or if you're a meditator looking to shake up your technique, that's a good one.
Yeah.
So our third category from Bill's journal is asking. And asking is also a very big topic in the course, and Bill mentions it in his journal as well. As the story goes, and as we learned from our interview with Carol Howe in our last podcast, Bill wasn't a big devotee of Jesus, and he doesn't mention the Holy Spirit in his journal at all. But that didn't stop him from asking for guidance alone and for asking along with Helen. So this is something that features prominently in the journal as well. So what does he have to say about it?
Yeah, it's a major theme, which I know it was a major theme with both Helen and Bill. In fact, that meditation instruction you just mentioned, that was meant to help Bill become better at hearing guidance. That was the point of that instruction. So in his journal, he talks about asking for guidance, asking with someone else, asking about things going on inside of him, like why he was upset about something, asking about things on the outside, when to call someone who needs help. He mentioned past guidance he'd gotten, so he retained that past guidance in memory. And he was turning to it for things in his day. So let me go ahead and mention a couple of stories here. In one place, he says, during meditation, I asked why I was having a conflict reaction and received the answer, quote, "You are afraid of release from imprisonment, which is what you were describing in the letter about Mrs. P." And that was the mother of his friend Chip. End quote. He says, this makes good sense. And there is no question that I am afraid of release. So he's asking, like, why am I having this conflict reaction? And he gets this really interesting bit of guidance. And then in another event that he relates, he had to go do a professional presentation. And he says, although I experienced considerable anticipatory anxiety, I tried to keep in mind that the one who sent me would tell me what to do and what to say. And of course, that's a reference to the famous truly helpful prayer. He says, this is all in caps, which means all emphasized. For the first time in my experience with this kind of professional talk, I decided that it was not necessary to have notes or an outline, and that I would simply follow what it says. So follow the guidance. From the standpoint of conviction, this should be very compelling to me because I spoke for 20 or 25 minutes without any difficulty. And I believe with reasonable coherence, covering the essential orientation points which were necessary. it would probably be very difficult for me to reconstruct what I actually said, but I could gauge from audience reaction that it seemed in the right direction. This is kind of big because he was afraid of public speaking.
Yeah, and there's so much here. Like, so in that first line that you read from the second passage, although I experienced considerable anticipatory anxiety, I tried to keep in mind that the one who sent me would tell me what to do and what to say. So as I was saying before, that's not highlighted in any way. It's not in quotes, but those who are familiar with the Truly Helpful Prayer will recognize that that's a line from the Truly Helpful Prayer.
Yeah.
And so again, there's so much here. Where do you want to kind of go with it? I'm inclined to mention that we tend to think that Helen was the one with the receiving gift. And sometimes as students, we feel intimidated because the course tells us to ask all the time. And if we don't hear, then it's tough to find the willingness to ask. And when we are faced with like a Helen, it's like, well, I can't hear like that, so why bother asking? That's something that we hear quite often. Bill wasn't obviously the receiver, but this is an example in his journal of how his willingness to ask resulted in true guidance, really helpful guidance. And so I feel like we should use him as an example and be willing to ask ourselves, even if we think that we can't hear so well.
That's a good point, especially given that initial discourse that led into the beginning of the course dictation, where the meditation instructions come through, because Bill was saying, I'm asking and I'm not hearing, I need help with this. And he was wanting to know how to hear better. He was also wanting to lean on Helen to ask for him. And so here he's starting out frustrated, clearly, with his apparent inability to hear. And he seems to have developed quite a gift for it, which is very encouraging for the rest of us.
Right. And so that meditation instruction that we mentioned earlier, here I am, Lord, wasn't Jesus saying that he was trying to help Bill quiet his mind because it flits about too much and Jesus can't get through? He said that that Bill hangs up too quick. And
that was a different one.
Oh, okay.
This one was it flits about too much. And the one right before the meditation instruction, I think, was he just gives up hope and hangs up, essentially.
Okay. Well, the point here is that Bill wasn't as gifted, clearly, at hearing as Helen was, but these passages are demonstrating that his willingness to ask brought real fruit. He was able to stand up and give that professional talk without any notes because he really trusted that he would be told what to do and what to say. And that's huge because evidently, in all caps in his notebook, it says, or in the journal, it says, for the first time in my experience with this kind of talk, he just relied on the message to come through. And that's big. That's very important.
Yeah, especially given just how anxious he was about public speaking. And I like his guidance about his own conflict reaction. You are afraid of release from imprisonment, which is what you were describing in the letter to Chip's mother. I mean, that's really helpful guidance. When I ask for guidance, I tend to not get like a sentence like that. I get maybe just this general essence of an idea.
Yeah, I hear you on that. Whenever I've gotten a complete sentence, I remember it, like it's emblazoned on my mind because it doesn't happen as often as I would like.
Yeah.
Okay, so our fourth category in Bill's journal is mind watching. And one of the most interesting aspects of Bill's journal, in my view, is the way in which he very acutely watched his mind for ego reactions and negative thoughts and so on. And so once again, it's reflective of how seriously he took this practice, that he was really, really trying to take responsibility for his thoughts. And that shows in what he wrote.
It really does. Yeah. I mean, he's constantly talking about what was going on in his mind, in his feelings, and looking at it from the standpoint of, is this my ego or what is it? So he watches for ego reactions. aware that they're inappropriate and unhelpful. One of the things I like is that he doesn't mince words. He will just call out some reaction of his, not dress it up, not relabel it as spiritual. He just calls it out as inappropriate or unhelpful.
Refreshing, isn't it?
It is, yeah. He has this awareness that any negative feelings are a sign of ego. He's aware that there's this difference between, he seems on the surface so willing, but he's aware that on an unconscious level, he has a lot of unwillingness. He just has a really nice kind of no nonsense way of looking in his mind and just saying, what's there and being very sensitive to it. So I have a few quotes from his journal about this, and you see it everywhere, which I think, you were getting at. He says, I was aware of being somewhat upset while we were doing this. He then later on said, however, I seem to be responding inappropriately to what I perceived as Helen's ambivalence about doing the letter. This is a letter to Chip's mother. And one of the things we kept talking about was, he says, considerable slippage today with the usual conflicts and self-imposed limitations on peace. I mean, he's not dressing it up in nicer terms. He's just telling it as it is.
Well, the reason why we love that is because we try so hard to practice throughout the day, but not every day is perfect. And so it's nice to know that Bill also has considerable slippage, and that's just a memorable line too.
Yeah, he's looking at his day through the lens of, how did I do with the course today?
Yeah.
So we can relate to that. He says, was aware that Helen was having trouble, but did not respond in most helpful way to this. Rather, fell back on ego-oriented perceptions. And there again, he's just being so honest. And finally, in evening, felt depressed, aware that it is only my responsibility for what and how I perceive, but still have trouble with this. To me, the ability to just to look within your mind, notice what's there, and not modify it so that you come out looking better, that is so crucial and central to the walking of this path.
Yeah, and it's also, there's two things about this. One is that he's so aware that the course is meant to be practiced throughout the day. You had mentioned that earlier today when we were talking about this. Like, Bill really did try and stay on his mind, guard his mind, watch his thoughts throughout the whole day, and that's what we're meant to do as course students. And so it's wonderful and remarkable that he picked up on that so early. And the second is, when we think of a spiritual path that is leading us to a place of enlightenment, it seems like the practice would be much bigger than this, right? Like, it seems like what Bill's doing is so, I don't want to use the word basic, but I guess I will. Like, there's nothing that is like the true heights of the spiritual mountaintop about this. It's just watching your mind. But at the same time, when you do this well, it's what creates the space for those higher thoughts to come in, so that when you ask for guidance, your mind isn't so full of your own junk that you have room to hear what the Holy Spirit is saying. And so that's the benefit of this process, even if it seems, quote unquote, simple.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. He's not reporting any like shattering Satori experiences here.
Right. Like, Helen's talking to Jesus and he's like, I didn't do so well today. I mean, by comparison, I would be depressed.
Yeah. What that brings up for me is, in reading Carol's book, you have person after person that Carol has gotten, quotes from, just deeply affected by something in Bill's presence. Something happened while being around Bill. There was something inside his mind that was very filled with light. And what I'd like to say is, well, I think that is what happens when tons of daily choices, day in and day out, add up over years. One does become eventually filled with light, even without these shattering Satori experiences.
I think that's a really good point. And that's one of the things that we talk about all the time in our classes. And Marianne Williamson always uses the phrase, "You're building your attitudinal muscles." And mind watching is part of that. Like, it feels small, and yet when you do it enough, the result is big. And it can lead you to an evolution that really is truly spiritual. You do it.
Right, right.
Yeah.
So we don't have to think that unless I'm having some profound awakening in which my complete, view of the world is turned upside down,
You're
nothing's happening.
exploding.
Right. I mean, in the end, this is a journey towards love.
Hmm.
And these daily choices are the essential thing.
Right. Yeah, such an important point and such an
Yeah.
important part of course practice. So the fifth category that we have from Bill's journal here is reminding oneself of truth. So throughout Bill's journal, we can see that he's, again, really trying to incorporate the material from the text into his reflections from the day, and really trying to make an effort to apply it. And the way that he does that is you see this, as we've been saying, throughout his journal, where he's recounting material from the text that has come through so far. So what do you want to say about that?
Well, we've already seen examples of this. He's constantly telling himself, reminding himself about the truths the Course has taught him. So we saw him quoting from the Truly Helpful Prayer. He reminds himself of key principles. Like at one point, he mentions the first principle of miracles, that there's no order of difficulty in miracles. He just constantly is telling himself the truth. And I like that, because, it's one thing. I often tend to think, well, it's enough to know it in the back of my mind. Yeah, I know. I don't have to tell myself that thing. I know. But there's a power in just stating it to yourself. And sometimes he does it in all caps. So, for instance, he's talking about his relationship with Helen and the work they were trying to do on it. And he says, only our own perceptions, decisions, and willingness to learn that there is, and this next part's in all caps, only one thing we want to learn is the problem. Everything else that we impose as learning blocks are quite evidently reactions of fear, resting on the belief that truth and love are destructive. This is, and again in all caps, absurd. So he's really just constantly telling himself the truth that maybe he knows, but he needs to know it better.
Yeah. So Sarah was asking me this morning if Bill's journal was handwritten or typewritten, and he typed it out. And so these all caps were his way of emphasizing certain points.
Right.
And as you can see throughout, he does have these all caps for things that he wants to remember or focus on. And at the very, very end, he says, he's talking about Helen, and he says, she is, all caps, at peace, happy, radiant, and free from fear, all caps, when she recognizes there is only one thing which is real and only one thing that she wants. So again, here he is reminding himself of that truth.
Yeah. It's a great habit.
Yeah. So the sixth category that we have in Bill's journal is seeing others truly. This is obviously a huge teaching in the course. And so it's very, very exciting to see it here in Bill's mind so early in the dictation.
Yeah, it's not a huge theme in here, but I broke it out just because it's such an important theme in the course. He talks about it in particular in relation to someone he calls DF, and it's somebody he works with. He says in one place, importance of above is that between these two calls, I did try again to look with greater awareness of reality on DF, and that the change reflected in her later attitudes must be related to the change in my own perceptions. So he's not only trying to look on her in light of reality, in her reality, but he's thinking that changes in her attitudes are a result of him doing that. And then later on, he says, as long as I persisted in denying the truth in DF's mind, we were having trouble with this decision. So he apparently was having, he was prone to seeing DF in an uncharitable way. And he's calling upon what the Course has taught him to see, to see her in a more Course-like way, and believing that that actually affects her attitudes, that that changes the direction of conversations. So very Course-like.
Yeah. And what's interesting about that idea here in his journal is just how nonchalant he is about it. It's like he completely takes for granted that if he can change his attitude, then others will change theirs in response. He doesn't make a big deal about it in his writing. It's just assumed there. And so that speaks to how much this material was ingrained in him as well.
It's true. Yeah, it's true.
And I know this isn't directly tied to, well, yes, it is. One thing that struck me about Bill's journal is, and he says it right here in the very first sentence, when I saw Helen about 1:30 for the first time that day, she appeared particularly radiant. It is startling how much her appearance changes when she is quote unquote with it. There are a few times throughout
at least
Bill's
3 or
journal
4 times
where he talks about how when she's with it, this is the language that he uses, which assumes when she's in her higher spiritual state, her appearance changes. He uses the word radiant when he's talking about her this way. And so and again, he's just saying it declaratively. It's like, I saw Helen, she was with it, she looked particularly radiant. And when she's not with it, she evidently changes in her appearance somehow. And so there must have been something in him that was seeing others truly in the spiritual sense as well, seeing her with the spiritual eye.
I don't know. With Helen's appearance, he acts like, he at one point mentions that in this past year, since the Course began, everyone around her has noticed this. So apparently it was quite physically visible that her appearance would change.
That's amazing. I wonder how specifically it changed. Maybe we should.
I mean, maybe we should what? Ask Carol?
Carol, see if she knows.
Maybe so. Yeah. But I mean, it's not that, we all know that, with changing emotions, your face changes in very subtle ways and can convey very different kind of impressions and feelings without anything particularly moving on your face.
What is it? Was it lesson 155 with the quiet eyes and serene forehead? And those who walk the world as you do recognize their own. I wonder if that could be part of it. She just had a calmer, more glowing appearance because she was with it.
Yeah, although I think it's probably not just calmer. I think it's, I think something comes through the face when the mind's in a higher state.
Something to aspire to. Okay, so our next category is being truly helpful, which, as I mentioned, is a favorite theme of course students, many of whom are familiar with the truly helpful prayer, which was inspired by Bill's participation in a rehabilitation conference. That conference was held in January of '66, so it was held at the beginning of the year, and the prayer came along as part of the text dictation to help him get over his not wanting to go to the conference. So what we see here is that if the prayer came through in response to Bill's hesitation to go to the conference in January, we're now in August and September, and he's referencing the material from the Truly Helpful Prayer in his journal. So once again, here he is really trying to apply it. So he has a focus throughout on trying to be helpful.
Well, there's a huge focus. This is one of the main themes in his journal. I mean, the amount of, just to talk in old-fashioned terms, the amount of good Bill is doing every day is kind of astonishing and kind of humbling. And it's inspiring.
It's inspiring, yeah.
So let me just read some of the, bullet points I collected from the different examples. So he's giving love to others, especially in the form of helping them see their problems differently. And he treats this as a serious responsibility. He's joining with someone else in this, Cal in particular. He's doing it even when he's ambivalent. He makes a list of those who need his help, and he makes sure to take action on the list. He's noting miracle impulses that arise, the impulse to be helpful. He's asking about when to act on those impulses. He's prioritizing being helpful over his own bodily needs. He's recommending spiritual practices, playing a kind of spiritual teacher role. And all of that is in the hopes that giving love to others will lead to positive changes in them and to a sense of rest and peace within himself. So this is one of the main themes in his journal, and I find it very uplifting. So for instance, he says, the problem was in relation to meditation and asking for guidance, which followed writing a letter to Chip's mother. I was aware of being somewhat upset while we were doing this, although also pleased to have an opportunity to share in this miracle. The changes in Chip's mother are miraculous and demonstrate very powerfully the effects of love. However, I seem to be responding inappropriately to what I perceived as Helen's ambivalence about doing the letter. So Helen's writing the letter. Bill is feeling just honored to be part of this wonderful thing, but Helen is not entirely, unambivalent about doing this. So Bill's not happy with her. He said, I suggested adding a statement at the end concerning her wishes at present to stay in the hospital, which she still regards as home. So Ken Wapnick, in writing about Bill's journal, explained here, Chip and his mother had been separated for many years, and he had no knowledge of her whereabouts. Imagine not knowing where your mother is. Helen was finally able to locate her in a state mental hospital outside New York City. It was a heartwarming story. And Chip, Helen's patient, and she talks in her notes about doing therapy with Chip, was forever grateful to her for the loving effort she made on his behalf. And then I'll just mention a few more examples. Bill says, I mentioned letters to Marcia and Sid as being part of my list. List to be compiled in more detail later, and then, in all caps, action. He mentioned he had been helping R, a friend of his, whose faith in his ministry was badly shaken. And then a really interesting one is Helen had this sense the preceding night about 1 a.m. that they should call Bill's friend in Chicago, Joe, who was the one who'd had the suicidal thoughts a year earlier. And she forgot to relay the message to Bill, and she was very upset that she forgot. So Bill says, I also had rather dimly thought about this at the same time, although it was 11 p.m., but had not paid any attention. Okay. Resolution to call him in the evening of the 11th. We both got the same time to place the call. So they're asking when to call Joe. They both had this sense that Joe needed to talk to Bill, and they asked when to call, and they got 9:30. When I talked to him, on schedule, of course, I asked him if he had been upset around 10 Chicago time when Bill had that premonition, that sense, the preceding evening, and whether he had wanted to talk to me at that time. Answer was yes to both of those questions. Although he did not feel free to say too much during our conversation, it was the same type of problem, and he felt better as we were talking. And that's when Bill emphasized meditation to him. So there are so many other examples that I don't think we have time to go into, but you can see that this was a major feature of Bill's life and of Bill's walking of the Course's path.
I know, as you're saying, what a superhero. He was just running around trying to be helpful to those he came in contact with. And if we wrote journals for 2 months, how much of it would be, I'm talking all of us, how much of what we write about would be concentrated, sincere efforts to help others throughout the day. And the fact that he was modeling that was remarkable.
Yeah. And, most of the help is Bill just trying to help them see their problems differently. And now that I'm thinking about it, that comes through in Carol's book too, from later in Bill's life. He had a knack for helping people see the things that were so heavy for them in a lighter, higher, more, free kind of way. And you see that all over his journal here.
Yeah. Well, he was a psychologist, so presumably he'd be
Yeah.
very good at that. All right.
Although he
So
wasn't a clinician. I mean, he didn't do that I know of. He didn't do. Helen did, but Bill didn't like have patients that he did therapy with.
yeah, but he was swimming in that pool, so
Yeah,
he
yeah.
knew all the strokes. So
Although when he just one last thing on that, when he talks about what he says to them, it sounds like it comes out of the course more than his psychology training. And now there's just little vignettes, but that's at least the impression you get.
yeah. Well, from his journal, he's actively trying to help using the tools of the course. And in fact, there's one part of the journal where he says that he doesn't want to go to a professional event, or he's finding the content of it dull or something like that, because he can't see how it relates to the goals of the course. And so I had mentioned to you, I was like, it's interesting to see him say something like that, because we've all had this experience where when we get deeper and deeper and deeper into the material of the course, everything else kind of drains of its color, and you want to just go deeper into the material itself, into the course. And it's just interesting to me that Bill was having that experience where even his own professional associations were losing their luster, and the course was increasing in speed.
And this was a meeting of the Parapsychological Association. So this is not mainstream psychology by a long, long way. This is fringe science.
Mm-hmm.
So they're studying ESP, psychokinesis, precognition, etc. And you'd think that Bill might connect with those topics, but he's
But
really
even
seeing
that,
them
mm-hmm.
as too distant from the real goals of the course. One more thing I want to mention about Bill's helpfulness is it's really striking that both he and Helen are getting these senses, which the course would call a miracle impulse, that Joe is needing them, or needing Bill in particular, to reach out with helpfulness. They independently got those senses. They then sit down together to ask when to call. Then they get the same thing. Bill does call. And there's just so much that's said about that. They were a team in trying to help Joe, just as they had been when he had his suicidal thoughts the year previous.
Yeah, and that's yet another example of Bill receiving his own guidance and acting on it, and that he had a skill for that as well.
Yeah.
So, okay, so our eighth category here is the importance of interactions. And we know that Bill was very good at that as a result of all that we've shared so far about his helpfulness and whatnot. And Robert, you mentioned earlier his healing presence. So many people said that about him, that there was just something about being around him that was healing. And so we think that's a gift, and in some ways it is, but here in the journal, you can see he's really working at it.
He's
really working at his interactions with others. So.
Yeah, so many of the things that he shares in the journal are some kind of interaction in which he shares about his own state and his own ability to be constructive in the interaction. And here's one with DF. Oh, DF was his secretary. So he says, also, my attitudes towards DF and replacement for Naomi, who, according to Ken Wapnick, was a psychology staff member, are noteworthy. As long as I persisted in denying the truth in DF's mind, we saw this one, we were having trouble with this decision, I guess the replacement for Naomi. In the course of 2 conversations with her in the afternoon, there was a marked shift. During the first conversation, I made a real effort not to get angry, but nevertheless was somewhat judgmental and impatient about hiring someone because of personal charm, etc., rather than with an emphasis on typing skills. So he's really talking about how in these interactions, he's trying to maintain a certain state of mind. And to the extent that he can, it helps the interaction go forward. To the extent that he can't, it injects trouble into it.
I feel like there's more to say there, but we're running out of time here,
true.
so we should probably move on. We've got just a couple more categories to cover. The next one is joining. Joining is another very, very important topic in the course. Bill obviously joined Helen in a holy relationship, and we hear a lot about their relationship being both loving and somewhat contentious. And in Bill's journal, we get a peek at that from his perspective.
Yeah, I won't say too much about this, but he does a lot of joining in the applying of the course. So we saw him join Helen and asking for guidance about when to call Joe. He talks about meditating with somebody else, joining in meditation. He joins Helen in trying to be truly helpful to Joe. He
Cal.
joins with Cal, right? In fact, he says, have been meeting regularly with Cal from 8 to 9 each morning since last week, and that was to go over the notes. And this was a morning when Cal didn't show up, and it was their rule that it was okay if one of them didn't show up. He finds it helpful to study with somebody else, but he went on to study by himself. The point is that he really values the joining in different ways and around the different ways of applying the course.
Right. And as you're saying, he was joining with people beyond Helen, but there is obviously a strong emphasis on Helen here. And so do you want to say anything about her specifically related to the journal? That is our 10th of 11 categories.
Okay.
Helen and Bill's relationship.
Yeah, of course, they were joined in taking the course down. They were joined in trying to apply the teachings. Although I think their joint efforts to apply the teachings lessened over time. They were still in this early phase here where they were really, on it. And he's talking about the difficulties in their relationship and their attempts to deal with those difficulties. So he says, yesterday was noteworthy in that both Helen and I are making more of a concerted effort to look at the problem we are having and experience more success in doing so. The manifest illogic of our position in vacillating all the time becomes increasingly apparent and hopefully increasingly unacceptable. Whenever we vacillate, we are denying the reality of our experiences when we are in our right minds. And later he says, this is absurd. While I still have difficulty keeping this in mind consistently, the logic or illogic of the situation, depending on which teacher we choose, is difficult to miss. So, he and Helen also, they're working together on trying to get past their difficulties. I know that they didn't manage to do that. But there's clear effort being put into that process.
Yeah, you see that effort throughout the pages of Bill's journal. He's really trying, and you can see that Helen's trying. Yeah. So it's a shame that in the end their relationship kind of fizzled a bit, but they really did try. You can see that effort here, and gave us something great for humanity.
Yeah.
Okay, so our last category is progress oriented, and this one is particularly interesting because it's evident that Bill really wanted to get somewhere in his practice of the course. He wanted to, as we've been saying, to gain control of his perceptions, to be more loving, to be more helpful, to hear guidance more clearly, and so on. He wanted to make real progress for himself, and he wanted progress for others, particularly Helen, and that comes through as well.
It's true. And I would say, I know we're heading towards a big wrap up, but this kind of is in my mind, the umbrella category. The sincere effort to make progress so that he is closer to the goal the course has set for him, and so that he's experiencing the benefits and the results. He talks a lot about results. So he notes the negative results of giving into the ego versus the positive results of applying the course. He notes when course principles have been demonstrated in action. He notes when inner guidance has been confirmed. There's a few instances where especially Helen will get something. He finds out that what she got was accurate, and she's consistently like impressed, like, oh my God, it actually worked. So he talks a lot about results. He says about Cal came before 7 and left after 11. So Cal's with him for 4 hours. During this time, I was extremely impressed with how much he has learned by directly applying the course. There have been literally hundreds of episodes in his life where he has had immediate and startling results. Relationship with Jay, a friend of Cal's, has changed almost totally from past. As a witness, Cal is convincing in every respect. Wow. And Bill is all about seeing those results in himself and other people. And like you said, ultimately, it's about progress towards the goal. So he mentions a number, he mentions the whole progress concept just almost constantly. So I'll just give you a few quotes here. During this time, I felt extreme importance of mastering material, but still with a peculiar sense of unreality about it at times. The ego is hard to see for what it is. About he and Helen, he says, we are making progress, but our vacillations, and he mentions vacillations a number of times, our vacillations are so great that it is sometimes hard to see this clearly. And then he says later on, but as of now, I do feel that we have made some very significant progress. He says, I feel very encouraged that we are making considerable progress now, and much more than either one of us recognizes. And finally, he says, very marked steps toward goals, of course. So he's doing all these things, the reading, the meditating, the ask for guidance and all that. But to me, the big umbrella that it's all under is progress toward goals, of course.
Yeah, I'm sitting here kind of going through the journal as you're talking and relaying these quotes. And you're right. You're so kind of famous for doing word studies and pulling out how many times this word appears in the course. We really should have done that here in just 6 pages related to goal or goal-oriented progress or direction or commitment or conviction, because that really is the biggest of the themes that appears. He was so serious, and he really, really wanted Helen to be serious too. He talks in here about how he wants her to be more committed. He's feeling an awareness that she's not totally committed, and it's just, he continues to pound on this theme, and it's great that he really, really took it that seriously.
It's inspiring. I mean, the amount, I know we just have a pretty short journal, but in what he reports, the amount that's going on with him every day in his attempts to make progress, to use the tools of the course for the sake of that progress, it's inspiring. And like I said, it's a bit humbling at the same time.
Yeah. And it kind of, do you want to go into the wrap up?
Sure. Okay.
Well,
I just think that
quickly, because we're running.
I know. Yeah. I just think that we've kind of said the big picture. Here's how I put it later in the notes: trying to make inner progress toward the goal of the course and experience the results of that. I think that's the big picture. But then right next to that, and as part of the same thing, is his helpfulness towards others. And what he's helping them do is see things differently and make progress.
Mm-hmm.
So it's all about him trying to make his own progress, trying to help others make their progress. And there's also kind of a minor third theme of he's often joining with other people in that whole effort. And so it kind of boils down to a really simple picture.
It is a simple picture. And what is great about it is that it's so achievable. You know, you and I talk often about how we wish that we had more of a gift for spiritual phenomena, right? Like being able to have visions, being able to hear as Helen heard, et cetera, et cetera. But you know, we always say you need your level of reason, your level of discernment to do the interpretation that you do. And I need kind of both feet on the ground to do what I do in the back end of the circle. And so you know, we kind of compensate and justify the fact that we don't have that great hearing ability or visioning ability by saying we need the reason that we have to do what we do. But I was saying to you before we were going through Bill's journal that one thing that the course is asking us to do is to consistently be good. Like it's trying to find ways for us to do exactly what Bill's doing through his journal, to be helpful to other people, to see them truly, to watch our mind, guard our thoughts, extend our love, et cetera, et cetera. And that I was all excited about that because I was like, that's something that we can actually do. And there are countless examples of those who have true spiritual gifts who are still overrun by their egos. And so they're not able to fully apply those gifts because they're still sucked down by their judgments and whatnot. And so it seems to me like what the course is asking us to do and what the world needs most right now is just people who are purely good, just good people, good egoless to the extent that it's possible people. And that would be the thing that would heal our world and bring salvation. And what I am so inspired about with Bill's journal is that that's the things that he was aspiring to. They're simple, and yet they're extremely profound when you get them right. Because when you get them right, the spiritual gifts tend to come. Helen's radiance, Bill's physical healing ability, those things came from, that was the net result of a daily practice to get this right. So
Yeah. In the end, it is a really simple view of life where you're just trying to make progress throughout each day in every interaction in every moment. And you're just trying to help others make progress throughout each day. And Bill has apparently several instances per day of doing that. And what I find so interesting about that, like you say, it's all very simple. It just comes down to being good. Um, and it's so much of what I've derived or distilled from how the Course sees our lives. The only thing really going on here from the Course's standpoint is, are we making progress on a given day? And are we helping others progress on a given day? So somehow Bill got that in that first year, that it was all about that. And
yeah,
I think that's
first
amazing.
year. Yeah,
Yeah.
because the course is not asking us to judge our progress on whether we're having revelations every day, although that would be amazing.
It does put huge emphasis on that. But all of those gifts, whatever the gift is, they're meant to just be a support for the real thing.
Right, but the by far the greatest focus is on the smaller things of seeing each other
Yeah.
accurately
Yeah.
and being loving and being kind and being miracle workers in the world. So
Yeah.
it's
I
leading us to a
often,
place of true goodness. Go ahead.
I know we're out of time, but
So
I've often said that the Course wants to make use of the full spectrum of gifts. Ones we think of as more spiritual, like the ability to experience revelation or have experiences of vision. Ones we think of as more ordinary, like a strong intelligence and reason or a strong will. Um, but all of those it wants to use towards that single goal of progress toward love and helping
right,
others progress toward love.
yeah. And I didn't even mention seeing each other with true equality. So there's just all kinds of things that the course asks us to do that in
Yeah.
the end are just purely good
Yeah.
and
But
so needed
anyway,
in the world right now. So
it's such an inspiring example that we see. And he's not saying he's a saint. I mean, he's struggling in here, But the sincerity of the struggle, you can see, is what gets him to where people say he got late in his life.
Right. Right. So hope for us all.
Hope
Well,
for us all.
Robert, thank you so much once again for another wonderful discussion. As I mentioned in the intro, if anyone would like to download the Bill's journal and also the categories that we discussed in the podcast today, you're welcome to do that at circleofa.org/Bill. And we will see you next time for another recording of Exploring A Course in Miracles podcast. Bye for now.